Hi, everybody. This week we're going to be covering Chapter 3, which is probably one of the more important chapters in the whole text, and it's on pricing. If you're not pricing your events right, you're obviously not going to make any money, and you're not going to be a caterer for a long time. So, pretty simple concept on how we price, but you got to think there's actually a lot of things that go into it. So we're going to talk about some of those things here. We have overhead, materials, labor, and profit, basically. So what's overhead? Well, that's the cost of your facility. That may be your rent, it may be your mortgage payment, it may be your utilities, it may be your insurance, it may be the cost of fuel. All those types of variable and fixed costs that go into running a business, that's basically your overhead. And you have to take that into consideration. Then we've also got materials, or your food. Anybody that's bought food lately knows that food is going through the roof and continues to go through the roof. It's an interesting concept for a caterer and restaurants in general, hospitality in general, is we've got to be very cognizant of the fact that our costs keep going up all the time. And how do we get around that? How do we work with it? How do we just pass that on to our end customer, to our catering client? Do we make adjustments in our menu? There are a lot of different things we can do to combat the rising cost. With catering, you're almost always in a competitive market. And so you've got to be very slick with how you do that. Next is labor. And labor is obviously next to food, or right along with food, your most expensive cost. Typically in a regular operation, if we can run 30% food cost and 30% labor cost, 60 combined, that leaves 40% for overhead and hopefully a little bit left over. But labor continues to be costly. Getting good people, the cost of benefits have been on the rise, workers' comp, Social Security contributions, all those things go into the whole labor cost. The last thing we need to look at is profit. We hope there's some profit left over after the overhead and materials and labor. Sometimes companies will say we're going to set a certain labor or a certain profit percentage and then work their numbers around to make that. In other words, we will only spend X amount on materials. We'll only spend X amount on labor because we expect to hit a 10% profit margin. There's nothing wrong with doing that. If you can actually set that, that's a good way to do. So when we're doing pricing, you have to add basically all those things together and come up with a cost for your event. Now your text has a pretty decent recipe analysis page where you can go and do the costing on that. I think everyone in these classes have had purchasing before, so it's basically the same thing that we have done before. Taking a whole of something, figuring out how much you're going to use, and then using that as your per unit cost. I think we've all been there before. So several things go into the rising cost, and we talked about your overhead in general. Fuel cost, for example, with transportation. If you're doing any off-premise catering or you're taking your items from here to there, you've got to worry about fuel. It wasn't that many years ago, and I think we talked about this in the purchasing class, that we were tacking on an additional delivery fee just for catering events because of the gas. $4 a gallon, we were paying a premium just to get the food from here to there, and so we pass that along to the client. We've looked at, depending on where you're at, rates for insurance have gone up because of storms. You take the people on the East Coast that have had a lot of hurricanes this last several years, their business insurance has gone way up. Well, that's got to be figured into the cost of the event, and spread out. So those things have gone up and caused us a lot more. And we already addressed some of the things that cause labor to go up. But some of the things that are causing food to go up, and we have to think about when we pick food, we look at seasonality. And we've talked about that through the other courses. If an item is in season, it's obviously going to be better, and it's also going to be less costly than when we get out of season. If we buy something from out of season, we're going to have to ship it from somewhere. that transportation cost is going to get passed on to the end user, the restaurateur, who then has to pass that on. So we try to buy things that are seasonal. We also try to buy things that are readily available. The more trouble we go to have to get something special to us, the more it's going to cost in the long run. So buying the right type of product can help keep our costs lower and more in line. Another big issue for caterers is, when it comes to the pricing, is portion control. And this is one of the questions we probably get asked more than any other, is I've got 50 people coming to this event, how much food should I make? Or I've got 100 people coming and I've got 2 meats, should I make equal amount of the chicken as I do the roast beef? Should I have a full portion for each? And I'll tell you, that is a very tough question, because there's really no good answer to it that I found through all the years, and I've catered for 25 years. A lot of it depends on your event, and we'll give you a good example here. We just did an event recently at school, just last week. It was for the grand opening of our new Student Services building. So I had a discussion with someone else on staff about this, and we have had a number of events on campus that weren't necessarily well attended. The numbers just didn't match. We look at some of the Christmas events we've had and stuff. We've had a lot of food left over. So, there was a great debate on what we should plan for this one. The key factors on this was, it was a lunch event. It started at 11:30. So it's a lunch event that's going to go for a couple of hours during the week and free food. So when you add those things together, lunch, free food, during the week, I figured we would get hit hard. And the final numbers went way over what we'd expected. At least a 10% increase in the number of people. So you have to kind of look at some of those things. It's hard to guess, but you have to figure out when the event is, who's coming to the event. If we were doing something for, say, one of the local football teams, we would probably do a little bit more food than we would if it was a local group of those little old ladies who wear the red hats. So you got to know your market, and you got to know all the different parameters of the event, and that will help you somewhat with portion control. It is never a good idea to run out of food when you're a caterer. I've seen too many events. One at a school I went to work for, shortly before I went to work at the school, one of the big donors of the school who donated millions basically didn't get served steak because the chef at the time ran out of food. And they made the infamous comment that they would have to stop at McDonald's now on the way home. That chef wasn't there very much longer after that, and I got his job, which worked out for me. So proper portion control, making sure that people get enough. You don't necessarily want them to take food home, and that gets into a whole other legal issue we'll talk later about letting people take things home. So those are some of the things you have to think about, is what food you serve, how much you serve of it, when you do your pricing. Now, if we get back to a couple basic tenets of how we price, there's a couple of things we can look at. You can go cost-based pricing. So we take the cost of our costs, and we need to figure in that overhead, the labor, materials, and potentially any profit we want. And that's what's going to be the price we do for events. We put all that on our menu, we put it out there, and hope for, people are going to go for it. Another way we can look at this is a client-based pricing. This is a little bit trickier, but here we're going to charge what we think people will pay for it, what that perceived value people are going to have for the event. I think last week we talked about a caterer that I used to know in Indianapolis that was the most expensive caterer in town. That was their thing. That was their shtick. If you wanted the most expensive caterer, which was all about bragging rights, that's who you went to. So sometimes offering things that may be greater in perceived value, you can charge more for. Now, what might those things be? It might be the style of service. We only do white linen, tuxedo-clad servers, caviar and lobster type events. you do have a little bit higher cost there, but still, it really doesn't cost that much more for a tuxedo-clad waiter than it does somebody in, well, not a tuxedo. So that perception, the value that people think they're going to get is worth a price, and a price that some people are willing to pay. You'll always have issues with catering when someone tries to undercut you. In fact, I've got a couple supplemental videos today on how to price your events. One of them is what happens when somebody tries to undercut you, because a chicken breast is a chicken breast. If somebody's willing to do it cheaper than you, well, you have to figure out why they're doing it. Should you be doing it cheaper? There's no reason that says you should do it cheaper. Maybe they have a lower profit margin. Maybe their overhead isn't as much. Maybe they have all family working, so they have no labor. Those are the things you've got to think about. That leads us into our third strategy for pricing, and that's competitive-based pricing. Now, as the name implies, competitive-based pricing means Joe's Catering down the street charges $9.95 for a chicken breast dinner. So we're going to charge $9.75. And that gets us right back to the things I just mentioned, the fact that we don't know all the parameters. He might have all family working for him. He may have inherited the building from a family member. His whole overhead and cost structure may be completely different than yours. So when you go and you start dropping your price to match someone else's, and you find out, we've got higher overhead. We can't match their type of pricing. So that's a real issue with competitive. It's going to play out depending on the market you're in. A big city, say when I was in Indianapolis, where there are 300 different caterers, it becomes more of an issue when you look at price. Say a small area here, if you were going to do a catering operation here, I think price is still important, although you're not going to have any competition. Here it might really be perceived value. I don't know what perceived value would be in this area. Chicken strips and mashed potatoes, is one perception of a catered event here. But I think if you could inform your public and go after the right type of market here, I think you could make good money. We get so many calls for caterers now because there's just nobody doing it. But anyway, so those are three kind of strategies for pricing. So read this chapter. Be sure and look over the 3 other videos that I have on pricing. They're all short, about 10 minutes or less. And then we will start to move on with other aspects of the business. Eventually here in about another week or so, we'll start talking about your projects again. Remember, you've got a couple projects in this one. There's a menu project, and there's also a project where you're going to put your own little catering operation together. And we'll start talking about those more in depth next week. So, this time, read the book, have fun, you have a good week, and we'll see you soon.